Hi and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. After spending most of last week working on my video where I reviewed most zoom lenses and a few small prime lenses from Sony, Canon, Nikon and even some third-party ones, I thought this week I should really do something different, and I decided to work on some older projects that I've never actually gotten around to even looking at the photos. These days I spend most of my time just making videos and editing photos specifically for the reviews, like lens reviews for instance, but I hardly ever get time to work on some of my personal projects, so that's what I wanted to do. And one of those projects was a trip to the remote Cape York Peninsula last year in May to photograph the critically endangered and beautiful little golden-shouldered parrot. These birds live in quite remote areas in sort of open savanna bushland and breed in these really cool looking termite mounds. So every morning we would get up in the dark and drive a really dodgy tiny little four-wheel drive track to the area where the birds are in. It probably took us like 45 minutes to an hour to travel like 2 kilometers, and once we get there we jumped into our hide so we wouldn't disturb the birds at all, and then it just became a waiting game. Are the birds going to come? Are they going to pose for us? So this is what we did basically 5 days in a row, and in the end we came away with some really nice images. It was a lot of work, a lot of standing around, a lot of waiting, but if you spend the time you usually end up with some nice photos as well. In terms of equipment, I used a lens called Lens Hide to hide myself, and then I used an R5 with my RF600mm prime lens and the 1.4 extender to get most of the photos. In terms of editing, there was actually a lot of challenges with these photos because the backgrounds are usually quite bright and sunlit, and the birds would often still be in like light shade or mottled light. So there had to be a lot of rebalancing done to get the photos look really nice. And the other challenge is that these birds and these backgrounds, even though they look a bit pale in the RAW file, are basically already too bright and oversaturated. So you can't really use your normal workflow on these images, and I resorted to using a lot of curves layers and selective color layers. I really like selective color layers because they allow me to adjust the look and the feel and sort of punchiness of a color without affecting the saturation too much. In fact, I can actually remove saturation from the image and then add that punch back by using a selective color layer on a certain channel. If you have never tried selective colors, you should definitely check it out. It's an amazing tool to make your images look amazing and separate certain colors so that each color stands out and looks perfect. In terms of workflow, of course, I always start with my PROSETS to give me a good starting point. And then in Photoshop, I select the bird and the background so I can treat them separately. And then I used mainly a few different curve layers to brighten certain areas and darken certain areas. And then I used a whole bunch of different selective color layers on all the different channels to make each of the colors really pop and stand out without being too crazy oversaturated. And if you want to learn to make your images stand out and get the perfect colors, I'll link my PROSETS and masterclass for you down there in the description. And in there, I teach you step-by-step things like curves, selective color layers, and so much more that will help you to make your own images look absolutely amazing. Why do APS-C cameras always seem to disappoint a little bit when they come out? Well, maybe disappoint isn't the right word, but they never seem to truly fully hit the mark, do they? I may be a little bit biased because I'm mainly a bird and wildlife photographer, but on the other hand, I think this is where these cameras truly shine because they give us a real-world advantage by adding effective focal length to our lenses, and we get more pixels on the bird. Whereas on the shorter end, I think it's actually kind of annoying to work with a crop factor camera because you have different lenses to get like wide enough shots, for instance. So I think for most people and the average user, a full frame camera is a lot more attractive. Whereas for us wildlife photographers, a great APS-C crop camera is actually a true advantage in the field. So why do most APS-C crop cameras appear to be kind of spec down entry-level cameras rather than being slightly higher spec wildlife focused cameras? I think both the R7 and the new released Sony A6700 are great examples of it. They're fantastic cameras on their own and they can definitely shoot great wildlife photos, but at the same time I think people would have been happy to pay slightly more and get a slightly better spec'd out camera that can be truly amazing when it comes to wildlife photography. Would you agree? I think things especially like the rolling shutter and the electronic shutter mode that both of these cameras have is something that would have been great to see addressed a little bit more, for instance. This is why I hope that eventually Canon and Sony and maybe Nikon in the future, if they release an APS-C camera, look at other brands like Panasonic or Fuji that have fantastic crop cameras that even have stacked sensors, so you don't have to deal with some of these issues like the rolling shutter. Let's look at the new Sony A6700 for a little bit. I watched all the reviews I could possibly watch on YouTube about it because I was quite excited about the camera, and now I kind of have mixed feelings about it, even though it sounds pretty good overall. It has a 26 megapixel APS-C crop factor sensor, the same one that we can also find in the FX30. So it's a fantastic little sensor with great dynamic range and also great video features. We have IBIS in the body, and we have a nice bigger overall body with a bigger grip and a nice wheel for like shutter speed or exposure at the front as well. Because one of the main issues I had with these little cameras in the past, this is an A6300, they are so tiny that you can't really hold them, and for wildlife with a bigger lens, they really didn't lie good in your hand. It was actually quite difficult to do any sort of real photography with these cameras. So having a slightly bigger body that also has a bigger grip is definitely welcome and great to see. Even though personally, I would have preferred a body that's at least the size of the R7 or maybe even slightly bigger, because with bigger lenses especially, this lies much better in your hand. What I love about the A6700 is that we have 3 wheels on the camera. We have a wheel in the back, we have a wheel on top, and we have the wheel on front. So it's easy to manage full manual mode. One thing I didn't like about the design is that it doesn't have a joystick. What is it actually with all these manufacturers leaving out the joysticks? I think it's something that's pretty good to use and pretty much needed in the field, especially when you want to maneuver the autofocus around a little bit. But I suppose the manufacturers think the fully automatic eye tracking is so good these days that you don't really need the joystick, which is true to a degree, but I still think it would be nice to have a joystick. What's nice to see as well that the A6700 has a fully articulating screen that also flips out forward, pretty much the same one you have on this R7 as well, which is pretty much a nice sort of all-round screen. What I found interesting when watching the different reviews is how different people talk about the autofocus. Some people say it's amazing, and I watched some other videos where people struggled with it. So of course it could be different cameras or people using the camera in wrong ways, but it sounded like in some reviews that at greater distances at least, the autofocus struggled to pick up the subject, but up close it was fantastic. So I think we have to watch a few more reviews and see the cameras more in the field, the final production models, to have a final sort of conclusion about how good the autofocus is. But overall, it should be pretty good because it also had Sony's AI autofocus unit, so it should be very good and should do the tracking very well. But there was definitely some comments that kind of concerned me a little bit, like it couldn't find the subject in the distance. And Jared Poland, for instance, said that with the 200 to 600, he found the autofocus to not work as well, which would be a great shame for us wildlife photographers. Either way, the autofocus definitely seems to be a huge upgrade compared to the A6600. The biggest step up from the A6600 to the A6700 is probably all the video features. The A6700 has almost uncropped 1.04 crop 4K oversampled from 6K up to 4K 60 frames per second, so that's fantastic. The only issue seems to be that, again, depending on different reviews, the camera seems to overheat after 25 to 30 minutes of filming if it gets a little bit hotter. What's great about the camera is that it also shoots in 4K 120 frames per second, so you get nice high resolution slow motion. The only problem is you're dealing with a 1.6 crop then, so it crops in a lot and it overheats quite quickly. But for 4K 120, you usually don't shoot like 10-15 minute long clips, so it shouldn't be as much of an issue. None of the testers unfortunately liked the rear screen or the EVF. They said it's too low resolution and it doesn't look nice to look at your images on the screen or the EVF. The other thing is, like on this A6300, it's very far offset to the left, which I personally always found quite awkward. I much prefer an EVF that's kind of more in the center of the camera, especially if you're someone who uses the left eye for photography. This will be quite awkward because it will be fully blocked your other eye by the camera. What I found odd about the A6700 is that it shoots 11 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode, but then also only 11 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. So basically, why even bother with the electronic shutter mode? Because it has a lot of rolling shutter, which you don't get in the mechanical shutter mode, and you have no advantage because it doesn't shoot at a higher frames per second. So unless you need completely silent cameras, basically there's no reason to use the electronic shutter mode at all on the A6700. The R7, for instance, has a great advantage in the electronic shutter mode because with the mechanical shutter it shoots at 15 frames per second, and in the electronic shutter mode it shoots at 30 frames per second. Yes, it has a lot of rolling shutter then and some wobbles, but at least you get an advantage because now you get 30 frames per second. So I would have definitely liked to see Sony at least at like 20 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode, because 11 frames per second is not amazing these days. The other issue is the buffer. You get about 59 shots in the compressed RAW files, which is adequate because with only 11 frames per second that lets you shoot for over 4 seconds, which should be enough for most action scenes. In terms of pricing, the A6700 comes in at $1399 US, which is pretty much exactly the same that the R7 currently costs on sale. So it's not super cheap, but fairly well priced overall, I'd say. So what do you guys think about APS-C cameras, what I've said about APS-C cameras? Should they be more wildlife focused and maybe slightly more expensive, or is it a good sort of entry-level camera? I think for most entry-level people and for most sort of average day use, general use, full-frame cameras seem to have a lot more advantages, whereas for us wildlife photographers, you can definitely make a case that a crop camera has advantages. Unlike most manufacturers, it seems like Nikon still hasn't forgotten their older cameras like the Z6 II and the Z7 II, because both of these received a decent firmware update this week with some nice additions like a red recording box around the frame and the EVF when you're filming. They added a few more interesting features, but the main feature I think that most of you with those cameras would have wanted, we didn't get, and I think it's fair to say we probably won't get. And of course, I'm talking about an autofocus update, more to the level of like a Z8 and the Z9. Unfortunately, I think to get that, we have to wait for a new iteration of those cameras like a Z6 Mark III or Z7 Mark III or some other cameras to have that really good autofocus from the Z8 and the Z9 kind of trickle down into some of these lower end bodies. This week, DXO has also released their score for the Nikon Z8 sensor, which scored 98 points, which is pretty good, right on par with some of the best cameras on the market. So while I personally don't really read too much into these lab tests, I rather take the cameras into the field and how they perform. It's still interesting to see how these cameras stack up when it comes to like dynamic range, high ISO performance, for instance. I think what this shows though is that a lot of people who currently use a D850 will be very happy if they upgrade to the Z8 because they still get the great image quality and all the added amazing features of the Z8. We also got some kind of random Canon R1 news this week. Not much about the camera in general, but its EVF of all things. Apparently it's going to be very bright with about 4000 nits, no blackout, super high refresh rate, and nice and high resolution. Sounds amazing, sign me up. But of course, I think we would all be more interested in actually getting the camera rather than just hearing about it. But I think all of that, even just some more detailed rumors, is still a few months off, and it will be until sometime into 2024 until we can actually get our hands on an R1. And I'm pretty excited about it when it actually comes out because I think that's really what's missing from the current Canon lineup. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm gonna go back to the computer, edit some more of my old files. There's still tens of thousands of images in my archive I haven't really looked at, so I'm sure I can find the odd gem in there. And while I do that, I hope that you check out some of my other videos like the lens review I posted last week. Give me a thumbs up, leave me all your thoughts in the comments, and also check out my new channel membership that I set up. So if you head to my profile, you can hit that join button if you want to support my channel directly and get some special member perks. And before you go, also hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye.